Hello, guys. Um, Here co-hosting my first Zoom event. So, hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. I'm just doing the intro for Sharon, so she'll be with you shortly. She's just still admitting people from the waiting room. Looks like we've got quite a good turnout actually, so we're happy. Those of you who haven't met Sharon before, I think most of you probably have, but there's maybe a few people on the call who haven't come across her before, or not in the flesh anyway. I'd like to take a few minutes to just let you know a little bit about her and why I think she's qualified to be delivering tonight's presentation on the topic of COVID-19 and how this is currently impacting the private rented sector. Sharon has spent almost 20 years working for a FTSE 100 company and played a key role in delivery of some exceptionally large projects there, huge projects. Her position meant she often had to deal with a lot of government legislation, and so she's very adept at interpreting the meaning behind this and the impact it has on us as investors, as well as the direction of government's actually moving with policy, which is an important insight. Sharon and I have invested together for the last 15 years, and we were amongst the first landlords in Cheshire to be accredited with the Cheshire Landlord Accreditation Scheme. And then later, having demonstrated to various accrediting bodies that our letting agency, Foxdog Properties, was following best working practice, we would also become one of the first businesses to be accredited by the Cheshire Accreditation Scheme. Today, drawing on our years of commercial experience and a decade and a half's experience in the letting industry, managing a not insignificant number of properties, we're launching the Property Management Programme, or PMP, as we like to call it. PMP is dedicated to equipping landlords and investors working in the private rented sector with the systems and processes needed to keep themselves compliant and to help protect them from rogue tenants. Tonight, Sharon will be looking at how your investment properties might be impacted by COVID-19 and the ongoing crisis. So over to you, Sharon.
Welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you've made the decision to be with us here this evening. Now, if you're a little bit like me and you might be zoomed out as a result of lockdown, don't worry, just grab a pen and paper and put your feet up. And we're only here for an hour, so you've got the rest of the evening to yourself. Now, tonight is not your usual property webinar either. I'm not going to be telling you how you can get rich from investing in property, why now is the best time ever to buy, or how to get started with no money down. Instead, here's what you'll learn tonight. I'll be explaining the restrictions on landlords post-COVID-19 and what steps you can take to protect yourself from a rogue tenant. This is the missing link between property investment strategy training and actually achieving your property cash flow goals. The truth is, we don't know what we don't know. Few people who set out to self-manage realise the risks that they're taking. I'll make sure that you're well prepared for the weeks and months ahead as a property owner. The behind-the-scenes property management topics I'm going to share with you this evening are immediately actionable in your property portfolio. But first, let me introduce myself so that you know a little bit about my knowledge and background, and therefore how I can help you here this evening. I work with Steve. Steve is my husband and business partner. We've been investing in property since the early 2000s. Back then, we didn't know anyone else investing in property, and we certainly hadn't heard of any property training courses. We simply saved up enough money for a deposit and went and bought stuff. Our first purchase was a one-bedroom off-plan apartment, the typical rookie mistake I'm sure you've heard lots of other people talk about. We still have that today, and it's always occupied, so the cash flow is great, so I can't complain too much. We quickly moved on to buying two-bed terraced houses. Now, progress was a little bit slow. As I said, we hadn't had any property training at this stage, so we just went out and saved up for deposit and then purchased through an agent. And things didn't change for us for many years. It was only until the last recession hit that Steve's job in the car industry was impacted that things changed for us. Around that time, Steve was offered voluntary redundancy, and it was a good package. But I realised that if we continued investing as we had been doing, the money wouldn't go very far. We needed to fast track our learning. The upshot of that was that we signed up to the Tigrant training programme. It was here we learned about below market value and momentum investing strategy. And that really kick-started our property journey. The timing was really good for us. It was 2011 and lots of repossessed properties were coming to the market. We quickly built up our portfolio, and within 6 months, a friend of ours offered us £250,000 to go into a joint venture partnership with him. We weren't even looking for a business partner at that time. This was an opportunity too good to refuse. This also kick-started our property management business too. We were now buying all these properties and we needed someone to help us manage it. But in all honesty, we couldn't find any local agents that were offering the level of service we wanted for the management of our properties. So we set up Foxdog Properties. I'm sure many of you might have seen me speak with Foxdog previously. Now, we quickly started attracting UK and overseas investors to help them build their portfolio in the Northwest too. Nowadays, we work with professional investors managing their high-end HMOs across Warrington and Wigan. Day to day, we work with some great clients and we've had some really good feedback from our clients as Foxdog Properties. And I'd just like to share a few comments we've received recently. Claude has found that we've got a brilliant understanding of the regulations, and this is something I'll be covering later this evening as well, and helping him stay compliant. He also appreciates that we provide a good service not only to him as a client, but also to our tenants. And Chris, who's on the call with us tonight, has been investing for over 25 years. He's given us some really great feedback recently. And he comments that our attention to detail is second to none. Now, we are living in unprecedented times, and new pieces of legislation that impact us all as property owners have been rushed through Parliament recently. Let's take a look at the elements of the Coronavirus Act that impact us as property owners. I'm sure many of you will have already heard that courts are closed and have been. The original deadline was till the end of June. And if you've been impacted by this, you'll no doubt be aware that courts are still closed until the end of August. The current planned date for them to be reopening is the 24th of this month. Notice periods for Section 8 and Section 21 notices, so property possession claims, were extended. Section 21 notice periods went from 2 months to 3 months. If you were looking to evict somebody for rent arrears under a Section 8 notice, this went from 2 weeks to 3 months. So this is a significant change. And it's expected that these changes will be in place until at least September. Now, throughout lockdown, right to rent checks were still required. The government did give a little bit of leeway and allow people to do these virtually and use technology such as FaceTime or Skype or whatever app that you use in order to do these remotely. But that was only for a 3-month period. If you agreed tenancies using virtual right to rent checks, you now need to go back and do those checks face to face in order to remain compliant. EPCs were another element of our responsibilities that were not suspended during lockdown either. So if you were selling or renting a property during this period, you might have found it difficult to get hold of an EPC surveyor or gain access to a property that needed a survey. Hopefully, now as restrictions are easing, things are getting back to normal in this part of the property industry. Another responsibility that didn't go away during lockdown was landlord gas safety checks. Now, this is quite a difficult area, particularly if you had somebody who was vulnerable or shielding or simply refused access because they were scared to let people into the property. As long as you have done everything that you can to gain access and documented the reasons why the tenants refused access, then you'll be absolutely fine under the gas safety regulations. But do bear in mind, as restrictions are easing, you now need to do all you can to make sure all your gas safety checks are up to date. Remember, there's no grace period for these checks. Once it's expired, it's expired. It's really important, therefore, that you carry out these checks in a timely manner. And the final aspect that we still had responsibility for during lockdown was urgent maintenance visits. So some good examples here would be a boiler breaking down and the tenant not having any hot water or heating, or the security of a building. And we had both of these instances during lockdown that needed urgent repair. Now, the Coronavirus Act left the door open for something called the Pre-Action Protocol. This is already in place in the social housing sector, and it would have been very easy for the government to literally lift and shift this into the private rented sector. This is a complex, lengthy process which requires ongoing negotiation with your tenant both before and during the issuing of Section 8 and Section 21 notices. Now, fortunately, the government haven't imposed this on the private rented sector, but instead they have imposed civil proceedings. Now, this is not a change in legislation, but actually new rules in how you need to approach the court. If you've got a possession claim that's currently in limbo because the courts are closed, this is really important that you need to know you need to submit a written reactivation notice. If you don't do this, your claim will simply lapse, it just won't go anywhere. So you need to put in writing to both the court and your tenant your intention to carry through your possession order. At the moment, there is no template or form or information provided by the government of what you need to contain or what form this needs to take. So it's really important here that you consult with your solicitor or eviction specialist in order to help you be ready for when the courts reopen on the 24th of August. Another change, and this is an element taken from the pre-action protocol, is you need to provide a written submission to the court before the hearing of the impact of the coronavirus crisis on your tenant. Now, this might prove difficult. In my experience, once you've served a notice of eviction on a tenant, they tend to stop speaking to you. So how you get this information might be slightly challenging. However, under these civil proceedings, you now need to write to the court and explain whether your tenant has been vulnerable, have they been shielding, have they been ill, has their financial position changed as a result of the crisis. And the final submission that you need to make is a full statement of rent arrears. Now, the slight change here is that this statement needs to be provided before the hearing. The current rules are that this is provided at the hearing. Now, surrounding these rules, there's also the 8-week deadline between the issuing a notice and a hearing has been suspended. This means the court can now decide when the hearing takes place at their discretion. And essentially it means it's going to be longer than 8 weeks. I guess they're wanting to manage their resources and capacity to deal with the expected backlog. The government has said these new civil proceeding rules are going to be in place until March next year. But as with all things in the private rented sector, once new rules are in place, I wouldn't be surprised if these become a permanent fixture after March next year. Now, a glimmer of good news is something called the Nightingale Courts. Think Nightingale hospitals here. The idea is that temporary courts will be set up in public buildings to help increase court capacity to deal with the expected backlog. A landlords association did a survey pre-COVID that showed the average time between a claim and actually repossessing your property was more than 26 weeks. Do bear in mind that once the courts reopen, even with Nightingale Courts, things aren't going to get back to normal from day one. Some of the court staff might still be furloughed, probably working from home, and they'll be grappling with new ways of working, so it won't be an instant return to normal. Do expect delays. This same Landlords Association has already publicly stated that court waiting times are expected to experience even further delays. In amongst all the changes, there has been some good news, and that was in the form of the Chancellor's summer statement. The headline-grabbing aspect of this was the reduction in stamp duty until March next year. The 3% surcharge for investment properties still applies, but if you're looking to buy a property between now and next March, you will be paying 2% less than you otherwise would have done. The Chancellor also announced new job creation schemes for young people, training funding and apprenticeship bonuses. This is good news if you're running a business and you're looking to grow your business or take on new staff in the coming months. This might be a good way to get some additional funding and resources into your business. An indirect positive impact is hopefully that more young people will be seeking employment, might be leaving home for the first time, and therefore looking for somewhere to rent. Furlough has saved an awful many people during the crisis. Talking from experience, many of my tenants were adversely impacted by the crisis, and a lot of them have been claiming furlough. Now, this has been a lifeline for them. It's meant that they've been able to meet their rent payments in full throughout the crisis. It's meant that they've avoided racking up any debt or being at risk of eviction due to unpaid rent. Now, furlough is ending in October, but hopefully things are getting back to normal, and certainly my tenants are now back to work. Now, Rishi Sunak introduced what was essentially a new Green Deal. So for those of you with long memories in the property industry, you might remember Green Deal from last time around. This again is still around energy efficiency improvements. If you're looking to do refurbishment on your property and you improve the energy efficiency, you can claim up to 2/3 of the value of that work, up to a maximum cap of £5,000 per property. This comes into play from September, so this is definitely worth something looking into. And the final point that's relevant to the property sector is the VAT reduction for the hospitality sector. Now, here at the Property Management Programme, we don't cover serviced accommodation directly, but we do know many of our friends, fellow property investors, do have serviced accommodation within their portfolio, so we did think it was pertinent to mention it here. Now that the initial panic around the coronavirus crisis has settled down and we're getting used to a new environment, there are going to be some legacy impacts of the crisis that are going to be with us for some time to come yet. Impact 1. I have already mentioned the extension to notice periods for Section 8 and Section 21 notices to 3 months in all cases, whatever the grounds. And this is with us until at least September. If you're looking to evict a tenant for whatever reason in the short term, then it's definitely worth bearing these new timescales in mind. Impact 2. One of the best ways to protect yourself against a tenant who fails to pay rent in future is to take out rent protection insurance. During the crisis, insurance companies basically suspended all the policies. You couldn't buy one of these policies at the height of the crisis. And I can see from their point of view, it was unclear how significant the impact of tenants defaulting would be and how long this would go on for. Many companies have now re-entered the market, but with significantly higher premiums. And what was interesting is when the extension to the closure of housing courts was announced, premiums went up again. Now, in my experience, I've found that if you've got a tenant that does qualify for rent protection insurance, they're probably going to be low risk of not paying the rent in future anyway. For those in front of you who you think, I really do need insurance for this person, then they're probably not going to be meeting the insurance broker's criteria. And that doesn't mean you should question the prospective tenant before you. Now, if you want an introduction to our insurance broker for rent protection insurance or any other insurance needs for that matter, then just drop us an email and we'll do you an introduction. Impact 3, COVID secure ways of working. We have incorporated the government guidelines for COVID secure ways of working into our business processes. This is particularly evident around our viewings process. We have been specialising in helping people from Europe come to the UK for work at places like Amazon and the Hut Group for many years. So fortunately, we had quite a few virtual and video tours in our library. And these came in very handy during lockdown. We still had quite a few inquiries, not as many as we normally do, but a surprising number of inquiries. And these video tours came in really handy. We even managed to secure a few tenants on the basis of these video tours who were then ready to move in as soon as restrictions were lifted. We've decided to retain this as part of our viewings process going forward for every inquiry. We've had really good feedback from the tenants in that they get immediate feedback in terms of the property or room that they've inquired about. And it also helps us screen our tenants as well. We often deal with people who don't speak English as a first language. They tend to think that an ensuite HMO room is a self-contained flat. By sending them a virtual tour, we can make sure neither we nor they waste time viewing a property that just isn't suitable for their requirements. Impact 4, civil proceedings. So I've already gone through this in detail, but I suppose the legacy impact here is that it's likely that the new rules around how to approach the housing court will be with us past March next year. And impact 5, don't forget the Coronavirus Act is actually in force for a good 2 years. There are many clauses in this act which allow restrictions to be extended if necessary. As we've seen with local lockdowns and the tourism industry recently, restrictions can be reimposed literally overnight. Now, notwithstanding the coronavirus crisis, the onslaught of legislation in the private rented sector has continued throughout 2020. Back in March, the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act started to apply to all tenancies. This is yet another piece of legislation that makes it imperative that we're carrying out planned and proactive maintenance on our properties. Now, this act is for the benefit of the tenants, but as a property investor and owner myself, I do know that planned and proactive maintenance is essential to maintain the value of your asset over the long term too. And in the property management programme, we show you how you can manage this process in detail. Around the same time, the regulations for EPCs also came into force for all tenancies. What this means now is that any property you rent out needs to be graded E or above on the EPC rating. There are valid exemptions, but unless you apply for an exemption, or if you're renting a property out that doesn't meet these new minimum requirements, you are at risk of financial penalties up to £5,000. Moving on to April, the Section 24 tax changes that have been in the news for many years now fully came into force. What this means is if that you are a private landlord and own property in your own personal name, mortgage interest payments are no longer an allowable tax deductible expense. Instead, you'll simply get a 20% tax credit. This explains why many property investors over the last few years have been setting up limited companies through which to purchase property in order to minimise their tax liability. Now, it does depend on your own personal situation, so it is worth speaking to an accountant. Again, if you want an introduction to our accountant, just drop me an email and I'll happily put you in touch. Another tax change you might have missed in April is around capital gains tax. Now, if you sell a property and you have capital gains to pay, you have to do this within 30 days of completion of the sale. This is a significant change. Prior to this, depending on the timing of the sale, you could have had up to 22 months to pay this tax. So this is a significant impact on your cash flow as a property investor. Moving on to June, the Tenant Fees Act came into force for all tenancies. You may remember last summer this came into force for new tenancies, and neither landlords nor agents were allowed to charge tenants any fees in relation to their tenancy. This now applies to everyone. If you've got tenancy contracts in place that predate this and talk about clauses that charge fees to tenants, these parts of your contract are now essentially void. Now, a piece of legislation that did hit the property news headlines was that in July of the electrical safety regulations. In short, what this means is that single buy-to-let as well as HMO landlords now have to have an electrical installation condition report carried out at least once every 5 years. And you need to provide that report to the tenant as well. Now, I did mention right to rent earlier. I do hope we all know our legal responsibility to carry out right to rent checks for new tenants under the Immigration Act 2016. If you don't do so, you can be penalised up to £30,000 and in some extreme cases face prison. This has been very contentious since it was introduced. And previously, a High Court judge, when challenged, did say that these right to rent checks could lead to discrimination, and it looked as though they might have to be revoked. However, the Home Office took this to the Court of Appeal, and the Court of Appeal decision was announced over the summer. The ruling was interesting in that the Court of Appeal did recognise that these right to rent checks could lead to discrimination, but they deemed them still lawful. So they're still here to stay, at least for a while. The group who brought the original case is now looking to take this to the Supreme Court. So this is yet again something else that's likely to hit the headlines at some point in the future. Now cast your mind back to last Christmas. Seems a long time ago now. 19th of December to be exact, and the Queen's speech introduced something called the Renters Reform Bill. Now it has gone a bit quiet on this, and mostly fortunately, as Parliament has been somewhat preoccupied by the coronavirus crisis. However, it's still in the pipeline, so I think it's important that we know what is likely to come and hit us in the months ahead. The main aspect of contention under this bill is the abolition of Section 21 notices. If this was to go ahead, and it already has in Scotland some time ago, so it's not unfeasible to think that it won't happen here too. If this were to happen, this is essentially the end of assured short-hold tenancies. And there are immediate downsides that I can see for abolishing Section 21 notices. We have used them sometimes in the past for low-level antisocial behaviour. Now, the criteria for antisocial behaviour under a Section 8 notice is actually quite high. The person needs to actually have received an antisocial behaviour order or a criminal conviction. But most of the behaviour we see in our properties is more low level than this. We've had a tenant attack another tenant with a hammer and cause damage in the property. We've had a male tenant inappropriately proposition a female tenant, and we've used Section 21 notices in these instances in order to ask them to leave the property. I can see going forward that both tenants and landlords alike are going to have low-level antisocial behaviour issues that they won't be able to do anything about. Now, some good news under the Reform Bill is that the amendment of possession rights through the courts. At the moment, accelerated possession proceedings are only allowed in certain circumstances. Under this bill, the scope of this is likely to be extended. What this means is that in many cases, you'll no longer have to go to a court hearing, and so the whole process should be speeded up. The bill also talks about introducing lifetime deposits for tenants. Now, this seems like a good idea in practice. I don't disagree with it, but I'm yet to see how it would actually work in practice. And finally, their bill is looking to extend the scope of the rogue landlord and agent database. Sadly, at this time, there is no indication that there's ever going to be a rogue tenant database. So what else does the future hold? COVID-secure ways of working look like they're going to be here to stay for the foreseeable future. They're likely to continue to drive remote ways of working and the use of technology in our businesses. This is no bad thing, as it's probably likely to drive efficiencies as well. However, you need robust processes in place first before you can even start to think about automating them. And this is where our Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide comes into its own. It's been designed in such a way that you don't need any specialist software or systems in order to implement our robust processes into your business. Now, I've talked about court delays, and many people in the property industry are expecting these delays to continue going forwards. So it has led some people to suggest mediation as an alternative means of resolving disputes with tenants. Now, we have been involved in mediation in a few circumstances, and it has worked well. However, I'm yet to remain convinced that this is the way forward, where a tenant is simply refusing to pay the rent. But let's wait and see. Dare I mention the B word? Brexit is still on the horizon. It hasn't gone away. The next major deadline is December. And notwithstanding all the news headlines about trade deals, there is the issue of freedom of movement across the EU. As it stands at the moment, this freedom of movement will end when the transition period ends. This is likely to impact the tenants coming to the country, as I say, for large employers such as Amazon and the Hut Group, who rely on this sort of employment type to fulfil their labour requirements. And they certainly make great tenants for us. But under the current visa rules, they just simply wouldn't meet the entry criteria. Interestingly, I must say in the last 6 months, we've seen an increasing number of non-EU citizens with appropriate right to reside permits applying for accommodation from us. So I think this is a complex area and it's likely to continue change in future. If you're renting your property out, it's important to understand the changing demographics of your future tenants so that you can understand how best to look for them, how to advertise your property, and the sorts of tenants you're looking to attract in future. We see so many people end up on the wrong side of legislation simply because they didn't know what was required of them and they're now stuck with a tenant that they can't easily remove from the property because of a technicality. In my previous career, I worked for United Utilities for nearly 20 years. Much of my time there was spent dealing with the water industry regulator, with auditors, responding to consultations and dealing with government working groups. I've also seen what happens when enforcement action is taken, including disciplinary action, court cases and corporate fines. One of the many things I learned from this experience was that documentation and good record keeping is everything. When it comes to the crunch, the person with the most robust documentation is in the strongest position. Now, I know a lot of people struggle with paperwork. They find it tedious day to day. And until you've seen what can happen when you don't have it in place, it can be difficult to understand the importance of it. But believe me, good record keeping and robust documentation is one of the best ways you can protect yourself and your assets going forwards. This is the premise of the Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide and our 9-month training programme. With nearly 30 templates within our guide, we set out how you can keep on top of all your records and documentation in your business, how you can make sure to cross the T's and dot the I's so that you don't end up on the wrong side of legislation. The last thing you want if you end up with a dispute with your tenant, in arbitration or even go to court, is have your case thrown out simply on the basis of a technicality. Now let me introduce you to a concept that I found really helpful in my business, and that is of tenant avatar. In marketing, the definition of an avatar is your ideal customer. So here I'm talking about your ideal tenant. And let me explain why your ideal tenant is not just somebody who pays the rent in full and on time. That's just not good enough. I know an investor who purchased a 6-bed HMO. On paper, it looked great. He was buying it as a going concern. But what he didn't realise was that 5 of those tenants were working out their notice. And he was left with one tenant who paid his rent in full and on time, but was just so rude and obnoxious he'd driven all the other tenants away. And the agent couldn't persuade anyone else to move in either. Now, yes, that tenant could be evicted under a Section 21 notice, but we've just talked about how time-consuming that is. So a tenant paying their rent is not your ideal tenant. You need to think further and deeper than that. So are you looking for tenants who are students? Will you consider tenants claiming benefits or tenants with pets? These are all valid strategies, but you do need to understand your ideal tenant in the first place so that you can then go and find them. Let's say you're looking for tenants that are students. When people start calling you to inquire about your property, you'll be turning non-students away at this stage. So you can see, even if you don't yet have a detailed description of your ideal tenant, you have some idea in mind, and it helps with the initial screening process. Once you've started asking these sorts of questions, you can carry on the asking of questions of prospective tenants into the actual face-to-face viewings when you get to that point. Think of this as an interview. Now, obviously, don't tell them that you're interviewing them at the time, but on a viewing, you can ask lots of questions that can help you determine whether the person before you is your ideal tenant or not. This is an important part of the screening process and can help you spot potentially troublesome tenants before you go much further in the process. Now you've got someone before you who meets your criteria and who likes your property. It's time to get really serious about the vetting process and carry out references. This important aspect is usually the area that gets outsourced to an agent. Many people are simply unsure of what to do or scared of entering into a contract with the wrong tenant. Our process is very, very detailed and we have strict criteria. And we do often turn a lot of people away at this stage just because they don't meet our financial viability criteria. I like to reference everybody myself as well. I've tried third-party referencing agencies various times. However, they never seem to quite ask enough detailed or searching questions for me to understand the financial viability of the prospective tenant. Our ultimate guide and training program gives you access to our detailed vetting process step by step, not only what we do, but why we do it. We help you carry out your own due diligence in detail. One of the ways that is suggested to mitigate your risk against tenants that fail to pay the rent in future is to take a guarantor. And this is a great idea where a guarantor is available. You do need to make sure that the guarantor meets the criteria as well, though. Ideally, they need to be a UK homeowner. They need to have some skin in the game. But do bear in mind that not everybody can offer a guarantor. I mentioned that we often have tenants coming here from other countries. They're simply not going to know any UK homeowners well enough to put them forward as a guarantor. But that doesn't mean that they don't make great tenants, though. On the contrary, they're usually excellent tenants. Do bear in mind that a guarantor is not a silver bullet, however. A guarantor can also default. I'm currently helping a fellow property investor who is in exactly this situation. His tenant has failed to pay the rent and now the guarantor has refused to cover his obligations. The only redress he has is to go through the small claims court. So there are limitations to having a guarantor. I mentioned rent protection insurance earlier, and this really is the best way for you to mitigate the risk of tenants failing to pay their rent in future. And this is stronger again than guarantor. The insurance broker we work with will insure not only the tenant but the guarantor as well. So the situation my fellow property investor is currently in is completely mitigated. Now, I get, given that the very high premiums now for these insurance policies in some cases have pretty much doubled as a result of the coronavirus crisis, this might not be financially palatable for those of you who have many HMO rooms. However, it is worth bearing in mind on a case-by-case basis. I want to draw your attention to the 2015 regulations, which set out all of the documents you need to issue to a tenant before you agree a tenancy. Now, these documents do need to be issued by law to enable you to have the option to issue a Section 21 notice should you wish to do so or need to do so later on in that tenancy. And failure to issue these documents could prevent you or frustrate that process. Now, I'm not going to mention all of the documents here tonight, there are many, but I want to highlight this government booklet, the How to Rent Guide. It's interesting that in the primary legislation, it does specifically state that you need to issue the most up-to-date version to the tenant. If you issue an out-of-date version, it's as if you didn't issue one at all. And this is set out in legislation, as I said. My top tip here would be to download this How to Rent Guide from the government website for each and every new tenancy that you enter into. In reality, these topics that I've covered here tonight are really just the tip of the iceberg of the things you can do before and during a tenancy to protect yourself from a rogue tenant. In order to help fellow property investors still further, we've documented all of our internal business processes, checklists and templates that we use day to day in our business. And this slide here gives you an insight into what the Ultimate Guide looks like. The Ultimate Guide has been designed as a standalone resource, so if you are managing your own properties, it's everything you need to know to make sure you're fully covered, you're not leaving yourself exposed to any risks. Just forgetting to issue one single document could end up costing you thousands of pounds. In the private rented sector, the cost of mistake is massively disproportionate to the actual mistake made. We've been making this guide available for the last few months now, and we've had some great feedback from our customers, some of which I'd like to share. I think John's on the call with us this evening. So John has given us some great feedback in terms of the guide that he's found. And he's finished off by saying it's essential reading and recommended for new and experienced investors alike, as well as those acting as rent-to-rent managing agent and property sources. And Samantha Lynch of Blue Column Properties has been so glad it's filling the gaps in her knowledge as a new property investor. And she'll be referring to it time and time again, every time she's looking for a new tenant. We've also got a great feedback from Kimberly Smith of Malvic Property. Now, she does use an agent for many of her properties and will continue to do so in future. But what the Ultimate Guide has given her is an insight into what her agent should be doing on her behalf. Now she's an informed customer. She can ask those searching questions to make sure her agent continues to do a good job on her behalf over the long term. The Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide is essentially a business in a box. We know of several of our customers who've already used it to go on to build their own lettings agency. A few people have suggested to us that we franchise this information. If we were to do so, you'd be looking at least £10,000 to get your hands on our business processes. Instead, we're going to be making this valuable resource available for just £249. Now, pretty much without exception, all of our customers who've already purchased the guide have asked for the nearly 30 templates in the guide to be provided electronically so that they can use them straight away in their business. We've listened and taken on board their feedback. We've worked with a designer to create a white label pack of PDF templates. Being white label means you can add your own company logo and your own business details, so your tenants know these documents have come from you. And given that this is going to be a valuable resource in its own right, we're going to be offering just the templates available on their own for £99. To celebrate the launch of the property management programme tonight, though, we'd like to give you all an early bird offer of the Ultimate Guide and the PDF pack for just £199. Just think how much value that gives you when compared to the cost of a single tenant find. Now, given all the great feedback we've been receiving and the sorts of questions that we get, we've gone on to develop a 9-month training programme to even better support property investors. The Ultimate Guide forms the backbone of this programme, and we go into each topic in the guide in much more detail than is possible to do in a written process documentation. Each month you'll have access to online video tutorials. Following on from the learning topics, there are then implementation activities. These are practical activities you can do to put into practice what you've been learning that month in your own business to take your business forward. Each month there's also live conference calls with us where you can ask us questions about what you've been learning, questions about what's coming up in your property portfolio day to day, as well as share your experiences of actually putting into practice the implementation activities. Our first cohort starts in September, and we'd love you to join us then. Going forward, the registration price will be £1198 plus VAT, which comes in at around £1,400. But as this is our launch party, and to celebrate you all being here this evening, we're making an early bird offer of £999 inclusive of VAT. So not only do you get the 9-month online programme with support calls from us, you get your own personal guide of the Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide and the PDF white label pack of templates. Now, I do appreciate you all taking the time and committing to being here with me tonight. So for those of you live on the call tonight, I'd also like to offer anyone here a free 15-minute consultation with me to ask any burning property management questions you may have. There'll be a link to book your slot over the coming days at the end of the session, so do stay on the line and keep an eye on the chat box. For those of you here tonight who are professional service providers, you might have clients who would benefit from our Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide and our 9-month training programme. And for you guys, we've created PMP partners. For every person you introduce that goes on to buy an Ultimate Guide or register a place on our programme, we offer an introducer's bonus. There's no risk to you and no upfront cost. Simply pass us the customer's details and we'll do all the rest. You simply get a financial reward as a bonus. All that we ask is that you register your interest with us first. So if this is something of interest, just drop us an email to info@thepropertymanagementprogram.co.uk. And for all you budding property investors out there as well, if you're networking hard and you feel that you meet other people that would benefit from our ultimate guide or program, then you can sign up too. This isn't restricted to professional service providers. Do feel free to get in touch, drop us an email, and we can share more details of how you can get started. To recap, to celebrate the launch of our new brand and business, the Property Management Programme, you can get your hands on a copy of the Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide and PDF white label pack of templates for just £199. Now, if you're looking for even more value, we'd love to see you on our property management training programme in September. You can get access to this, the Landlord's Ultimate How-To Guide and your PDF pack of templates for £999 inclusive of VAT. Don't forget you can book your free 15-minute consultation call with me, and don't forget PMP Partners, our introducer scheme for those who want to join us in helping fellow property investors have world-class property management at their fingertips. Now, these discounts won't be around forever. I've shared a lot of information with you here tonight. There's a lot to take in, and you probably want time to digest it all as well. You might even want to talk to your business partner about these early bird offers that I've shared with you here this evening. So for those very reasons, these offers are going to remain available for the next 10 days. Obviously, the programme starts on the 1st of September, so we'd love to have you join us by then. Now, I'd like to raise a glass and toast everyone who's joined me here tonight. Thank you so much for your time. I know how valuable that is, so I do appreciate you being here. I hope you've learned something that you can put in your property business straight away. And I look forward to seeing you on our property management programme in September.
Hello, guys. So a lot of useful information from Sharon, as I'm sure you agree. I was just getting the fizz out there ready for us both. As you're probably aware, there's over 150 laws specifically relating to us buy-to-let investors and landlords. So arguably, the days of the amateur landlord are now over, and our businesses need to be systemised to survive. We all need to know that we're issuing the correct documentation and that we have adequate processes and procedures in place for each stage of the renting process. If you're interested in systemising your business literally overnight and want to take advantage of the discount Sharon discussed, follow the link that's in the chat box. If you missed any part of tonight's presentation, don't worry, we're going to be sending you all a link to the recordings of the presentation, as well as a bonus email with a list of useful links to some of the key pieces of legislation that we discussed tonight. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you all again in one of our future webinars. For those of you who are Facebook users, if you're not already in our group, please feel free to join Investor Circular. Sharon and I are signing off now, but don't forget to reserve your free 15-minute consultation via the link that we've posted in the chat box. We'll also leave the chat box open for a little while, just in case anyone out there is looking to make a purchase tonight at one of those discounted prices. Thank you very much, guys. Good night and cheers.